Good evening, everyone. Welcome back if you are one of our regular friends at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Special welcome if you are here for the first time. My name is Frank Clooney. I'm the director of the center and very happy to welcome you tonight. We think you've found the table for refreshments. If you get hungry or thirsty as we talk, please get something more. Very happy to have you here tonight for this occasion. It's one of our ongoing series of the center, which reminds me to say there's a mailing list email page there. If you aren't on our mailing list and would like to receive our advertisements of upcoming events, please put your name on the list in your email. But this series is the Intellectual Worlds of Meditation. It's a series that's been running for 3 years now. And the idea is to bring into the academy and into Harvard Divinity School not so much the teaching of the practice of meditation or prayer, but rather the intellectual framework in which it takes place, that there are many opportunities at the Div School and in Cambridge to learn the practices, but to have conversations in this room about how we go about meditating, contemplating, praying, and what this means. This began when the meditation room in the front of the building opened in 2010, about 2 years ago this time. Professor Janet Yatso here in the front and Professor Susan Abraham reflected on several aspects and dimensions of meditation and what it means, and we've been trying to keep up the series over the years. The longer history of this practice goes back to the very founding of the center and the opening of this building in 1960. If after we're done, you step out in the courtyard and look up, you'll see there's a large room space on the top floor, which would be the third floor, which when the center opened in 1960 was the meditation room. It's currently a little bit hard to use because it's not there's not enough fire exits and handicapped accessible and so on. So we're in the process of fixing that problem. But when the center opened, it was a clear distinguishing mark of the center that there be a space for meditation. And I think that is something we're trying to retrieve at the current moment. It sort of got lost over the years, to tell you the truth. This is the history of the center from about 5 years ago. And there's a famous passage in here where the very distinguished director in the 60s, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, talks about his decision to close the meditation room and make it into a seminar room. I'll just read you a little bit of his reflection. When we arrived, namely he and his wife showed up to be director in 62, there was a meditation room. It had been built as a kind of common place for worship with what the architects decided was the one symbol common to all communities, light. So there are different small windows that light was allowed in. They've been expanded since then. But we shifted the meditation room to a seminar room. The common room, this room, became for use in other events, but we needed a classroom as well and decided that that space would be the room. The point was not simply that the room on top was not being much used as a meditation room or worship center. More than that, on principle, the purpose of the center was not, we felt, symbolized by a common center of worship. On the contrary, the center recognizes that both in fact and in theory, people worship in different ways and in different places. Jews go to the synagogue, Christians to the church, Muslims to the mosque, Buddhists to the temple. And that having each gone to our own place, we come back and may still be friends. Therefore, we needed a common room, this room, and that is what it is, and a study room where we could work together intellectually, but not a meditation room since we all worship separately. And this, I think, was a perfectly fine idea to hold in the 1960s, and I think it has merit still to take this seriously, the need to sort these things out. But I think given today the wide interest in the Harvard community and the Divinity School community about the crossover between the intellectual and the spiritual, the practices and the reasons we give for our practices, it seemed opportune in the last few years to open a new meditation room in front, and then to have a series in which we could at least be talking to one another about what is it we are doing when we meditate, what are the purposes and the wherewithal. The series has been running, as I said, this is the third year. James Robson from East Asian Languages spoke on different understandings of Zen practice. He was our first speaker several years back. Father Roger Haight, a Jesuit professor from Union Theological Seminary in New York, talked about the Ignatian Jesuit tradition of meditation, both as a Christian practice but also open to a wider community of seekers. And his book on that just came out a couple of weeks ago. Swami Tyagananda from the Vedanta Society here in Boston spoke in the winter on Vedanta practices and the intellectual frame in which Vedanta takes place. Toward the end of November, I think November 28th, Reverend Brother Jeffrey Tristram from St. John the Evangelist Monastery down by the river will speak in our series. That date is about to be fixed, but I think it's pretty definite. And tonight we're very delighted and lucky to have with us a very distinguished person who has reflected for many years on meditation and also has a wonderfully long history with the center. Professor Thomas Coburn did his A.B. in religion at Princeton University, his MTS in history of religion here at Harvard, and his PhD in comparative religion here at the university. I won't steal his details, but he also has, he lived at the center and so on. He can tell you more about that. So it's welcoming him back tonight. For many years, Tom was a professor, as he says here, instructor to professor, all the levels and gradations of academe at St. Lawrence University in New York State, including being the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, the Vice President of the University, and the Dean of Academic Affairs. So he had a long and illustrious career of about 25 years or so, 29 years at St. Lawrence University. And then after that, in 2003, went out to Colorado, to Boulder, to the Naropa University, and became the president and professor in that university, the Buddhist University, which I think also he can tell us more about tonight. So a rich range of academic experiences in several connections and places that began here. He's a noted scholar of Hinduism and Hindu traditions. His dissertation sits in glory on the shelf upstairs. On the Devi Mahatmya, the tradition of the goddess and the great text and narrative of the goddess, which is such a common area of study nowadays, but Tom was one of the pioneers in the study of this tradition of the goddess in the Sanskrit tradition. And his book, Devi Mahatmya, The Crystallization of the Goddess Tradition, is in the enviable position of having come out in 84, 88, 97, 2002. So it remains a book that is in print. He also has a book called The Encountering the Goddess, a translation of the Devi Mahatmya and the study of its interpretation. I think these may not come directly into play tonight, but Tom is very much known in the circles of the retrieval of the study of the goddess traditions and showing the great interest there. But I'd just like to read to you finally a couple of other things from his CV, from among his many publications, that really show that it's not simply tonight that Tom is thinking about what are we talking about when we talk about contemplation, how do we think about meditation, but a long period of time. So somewhat randomly chosen, 1985, an article called Nattering Nabobs, Habits of Mind, Persons in Relation, The Future of a Liberal Arts Education in a Specialized Society. 1992, The Act and Art of Being Religious in the Organization of American Historians Magazine of History. 2000, Asia and the Undergraduate Curriculum. 2005, Cultivating Spiritual Academics for Leadership, A Presidential Perspective, which I think was when you were at Boulder, at Naropa. 2005 also, Secularism and Spirituality in Today's Academy. 2010, Council of Elders, President and Faculty Staff Relations. And 2011, The Convergence of Liberal Education and Contemplative Education, Inevitable, ? And finally, I'll go back to the information I found on the web about Tom's time at Naropa, which again, he can tell us more about. But one of the nice things Tom has quoted is having done the very important work of increasing financial aid for undergraduates by getting more Pell Grants and so on like that. And says Tom says, what this demonstrates is that Naropa is a national leader in providing opportunity for everyone, regardless of income, to obtain a college education. He goes on to say the commitment to providing access actually models the egalitarian outcome of contemplative education, putting oneself in service to other. And I think one of the remarkable things about Tom is that as a scholar, as a teacher, as an administrator, trying to cross these boundaries between what we do intellectually and what we do spiritually. So I think we're very lucky to have Tom here tonight, and welcome.
Thank you, Frank, for that nice welcome and introduction. It's good to be back at the center, a place that played a formative role in my life, both professionally and personally, back in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Those tumultuous years in America were a magical time for those of us fortunate enough to be in residence at the center. There was a real sense that, guided by the vision so compellingly articulated by Wilfred Smith, we were shaping the intellectual foundations of a new world, where religious diversity was prized, our understanding of it was deepening, and new possibilities for social justice were, we thought, emerging. Some of our enthusiasm was, of course, a function of youth culture's often naive idealism in those years. But while the Beatles went to Rishikesh, the Maharishi came to Cambridge, and the Coop began selling chapels, we took our charge seriously, plunging into the study of Sanskrit and other languages, and readying ourselves for the daunting general exam that we knew was coming one day. We would walk into a classroom and find a single question on the blackboard, along with 3 dates. The assignment was, discuss the religious situation in the world at one of these dates. What a wonderful question. You can imagine the challenge of simply organizing one's preparation for answering it. In retrospect, that exam symbolizes for me both the professional challenge and the personal satisfaction of those years, to which I add the happy personal memory of bringing my newborn son, Brooke, home from the hospital to live with us in the center's apartment 5. As I today pass through the center's doors, I find myself mindful of that wonderful line from a Buddhist meditation text, "What are we, if not our memories?" When Frank extended his invitation to speak this evening, I know that my presidency at Naropa from 2003 to 2009 played a role. Naropa, after all, places meditation, the theme of this center series, at the center of its curriculum. Founded in 1974 by the Tibetan Buddhist scholar and meditation teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Naropa describes itself as Buddhist-inspired, ecumenical, and non-sectarian. Meditation, in its varying forms, is woven into the curriculum of every department. In the context of the global history of religion, Naropa represents an aspiration to integrate the liberal arts tradition of the West with the contemplative traditions of South Asia in what I have called the confluence of 2 rivers. This is indeed a unique undertaking, but Naropa is part of a larger movement that is afoot in education, not just higher education, but also primary and secondary, so I need to broaden my focus beyond Naropa. That larger movement goes by the name of Contemplative Studies or Contemplative Education. It includes work that has been taking place for decades in some elementary schools and that has now been joined by the emergence in research universities of a new interdisciplinary field. It is fueled in part by developments that are taking place in neuroscience at a broad range of universities, both public and private. Emory and Brown universities, and the universities of Wisconsin, Virginia, and Miami, among others. That movement is producing groundbreaking research informed by the vision of the Mind and Life Institute. Now headquartered in Amherst, that institute grew out of the Dalai Lama's interest in facilitating collaboration between experienced meditators and neuroscientists. This new discipline of contemplative studies also speaks to teachers' interests in developing deeper levels of education that are customarily nurtured by the American establishment. This is the predominantly teaching mission, for instance, of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society in Northampton. It is represented at the full range of American educational institutions: liberal arts colleges, junior colleges, pre-professional schools, law schools, and medical schools. The contemplative studies movement is thus interested both in scholarly content, in subject matter, and in process, in the way any subject matter is taught and learned. It is this larger movement that will claim some of our attention this evening. But primarily, I want to talk about teaching and learning. I want to start there because, as a long-term faculty member and academic dean in the liberal arts college context, that is what I know best. So I would like to take as our starting point our lives as teachers. As my presentation unfolds, I hope to show an important but usually overlooked connection between meditation and what we academics do every day in our bread and butter activity of teaching. There are, in turn, important implications, I believe, for the way we think about meditation in academic life, with corresponding consequences for the emerging field of contemplative studies. Let me start by directly addressing the matter of the evolving identity of the center's so-called meditation room that Frank has noted. I suspect the question of whether that space should be a classroom or a library or a meditation room for academic or for spiritual purposes will never be answered once and for all. Each generation will have to take the matter up for itself, for the discussion is more important to the center's identity than any particular resolution. That said, let me offer a modest contribution to that discussion. I do so by inviting you to join me in a little ritual that I met during the presidential search process at Naropa, and that so charmed me that I said to myself, even if I don't get this job, I'm going to take this back to the classroom at my home institution. The ritual is as innocent and non-theological as a handshake, but if it makes you uncomfortable, please feel free not to participate. This ritual gesture is called simply the bow, and it is used at the beginning and the ending of every class and every committee meeting at Naropa, even those committee meetings that are contentious. The bow was created by Naropa's founder, and it provides a ritual framing for Naropa's group interactions, first anticipating those that are to come at the beginning of class or committee meeting, and then bringing them to closure at the end. The bow has three parts. The first consists of sitting erect, feet flat on the floor, hands on hips, arms arched in the shape of a bow. We lower our eyes and gently say goodbye to wherever our thoughts and emotions have been taking us lately, bidding farewell to the multitasking that so pervades our lives these days. Secondly, we feel ourselves fully present, attending to this particular place, gently aware of the floor and then the earth beneath, of the ceiling above and the sky beyond, and aware of the people to our right and to our left, in front of and behind us. Then third, we bow gently from the waist, offering ourselves to the other fully present people who are gathered with us, acknowledging that we have agreed to be present to and for one another, constituting a little community for the duration of our time together. You will have noticed that in describing the bow, I have used the language of being fully present and of attending to the present moment. I have done so as a preliminary bridge to talking about education, not about meditation, contemplating, and mysticism, although the language of focusing on the present moment is, of course, familiar to meditators, contemplatives, and mystics of all sorts. One might say that those who cultivate the inner life are virtually unanimous in affirming the importance of living in the present moment. They know that the human search for permanence is relentless and ubiquitous. So too is the seductive allure of past and future. Both that search and that allure, contemplatives say, must be resisted in order to realize the fulfillment and insight that comes from living in the present moment. But I use the language of present moment here not to talk about meditation as religious practice, but to make a broader point about education. William James made that point over a century ago when he wrote, and I quote, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical instructions for bringing it about." Close quote. That is the puzzle I want to explore with you this evening. How do we gain access to and cultivate living in the present moment? Meditation, it turns out, opens vast opportunities. Along the way, I'll try to indicate why the nascent contemplative studies movement is such a promising development at all educational levels. In this exploration, I want to offer what we might think of as a series of snapshots of different parts of this puzzle. Rather than developing a single line of thought pointing toward an incontrovertible conclusion, I want to walk around our topic, circumambulating it as if it were a three-dimensional sculpture, and offering remarks from different angles. I will offer 5 such snapshots, followed by a concluding integration. The first photograph attends briefly to matters of definition. For simplicity's sake, I will here be using the terms meditation, contemplation, and mysticism in a soft sense, without hard boundaries. These words have, of course, been variously defined, often with highly detailed nuance and distinctions by both practitioners and theorists. But for the sake of discussion here, rather than pursuing that variety, let me propose 2 simple generic definitions for what I call the disciplined inwardness of the meditation and contemplation that are conducive to mystical experience. The first definition is simply disciplined listening to self and other. The other is an ever-present invitation to ever greater openness. I include the words mystic and mysticism in the relevant vocabulary here because of their connotations of openness to a reality beyond our conventional awareness, a reality that becomes apparent in various ways, by attending to our inner lives, to the world of nature, and by deep, non-judgmental listening to other persons. Mystics are those who cultivate this openness in a variety of ways, especially meditation. So here we are exploring the affirmation that there is a dimension to human experience that becomes, or can become, accessible through orderly, disciplined attention to our inner lives. This attention notices the ebb and flow of our inner lives as we respond to the internal and external stimuli that come our way. It is often called mindfulness. Our second snapshot roots the issues in my own educational experience. I knew from the middle of my sophomore year in college that I wanted to be a teacher. I didn't know in what subject matter or at what level. But I had had wonderful teachers in secondary school, and they modeled for me the excitement of a lifetime in education. A.B. degree in hand, I set out to explore possibilities in the world of education. First, by teaching a required Bible course to sophomores at Phillips Academy, Andover. The second, teaching geometry, physics, and remedial math at the American Community School in Beirut, Lebanon. The latter year exposed me to the rich, warm, challenging complexity of the Arab world, which sowed the seeds for my subsequent attraction to the field of comparative religion. But when I came to the Divinity School in my third year after college, it was not as an aspiring PhD student. It was as a likely secondary school teacher. I loved the classroom, or possibly as a minister. Enrolling in Wilfred Smith's Survey of World Religions course changed all that. But even as I recalibrated my own degree aspirations toward a PhD, my interest in larger educational matters remained. When the Divinity School and the Graduate School of Education in 1972 launched their program in Religious Studies and Education, which has now evolved into the Religious Literacy Project, I had the good fortune to serve with Anne Trevelyan as TA for Carol Gilligan and Don Oliver on the Ed School side, and Jim Fowler on the Div School side. So, even as I trained to be a scholar of India, I was interested in the application of this knowledge to the classroom. This is why, in 1974, I was happy to accept appointment at a liberal arts college, St. Lawrence University, where I remained in various faculty and then administrative roles for 29 years. During the latter part of my graduate years, I was also invited to co-teach what was then Harvard's introductory course in religious studies. The title of the course was Types of Religious Expression, and it had an unusual structure. The course lectures were given by a senior faculty member, John Carman, and were designed to provide an overview of the Hindu tradition. Parallel with these lectures, each student enrolled in one of the 4 sections taught by a teaching fellow on the Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, and Islamic religious traditions. I taught the Christian section. The fall semester offered a synoptic overview of the traditions, and the spring semester was then called Transformations of Religious Experience. That spring semester focused on 2 topics in the respective traditions, what we called interiorization of external ritual and external reformation of society and ritual. At 40 years remove, I cannot recapture the details of our planning discussions, but in retrospect, it seems clear to me that our thinking was here being guided by Max Weber's famous distinction between prophetic religion and mystical religion. Both kinds of religion, Weber says, grow out of the gap that we all experience between what we wish for the world and for ourselves and our daily experience. This gap produces 2 kinds of religious activity. Prophetic religion seeks to bridge the gap by changing the world. Mystical religion aspires to close the gap between is and might be by changing individual consciousness. Prophetic religion focuses upon changing the objective external world, the world out there, while mystical religion focuses on changing the internal, subjective world, the world in here. This typology of religious life has proven remarkably durable over the past century. This is doubtless in part because it is such a useful way of organizing an enormous amount of data, which has grown exponentially over the years. It has also been widely used to offer broad generalizations about religious life, saying Western religion tends to be prophetic, world-changing, outer religion, while Eastern religion tends to be mystical, consciousness-changing, inner religion. This is in spite of the fact that in the century since Max Weber, and in the 40 years since my colleagues and I taught the Types of Religious Expression course, new evidence and new dimensions of understanding have become apparent. If I don't accomplish anything else this evening, I'd like to make you skeptical about this received way of thinking about religious life. Please consider the possibility that typologizing religion as prophetic and mystical, while sometimes useful, often hides as much as it reveals. In light of what we are learning about and experiencing in meditation, the conceptualization of human beings as having 2 kinds of life, an inner and an outer life, seems increasingly archaic. My third photograph this evening asks us to think not about religion, but about what we know about how teaching and learning occurs. There are two relevant research findings. The first is that learning occurs optimally for all organisms, including human beings, under conditions of moderate discomfort, when the organism is extended beyond its comfort zone. The challenge for the teacher is to create imaginative activities within this broad middle ground between boredom on the one hand and terror on the other. Ideally, the teacher is also beyond her or his comfort zone, so that he is personally invested in the edgy, challenging, intermediate space where learning occurs optimally. The second research finding is that the single most important variable in learning is for the teacher to catch the student or students at the proverbial teachable moment. This occurs when the individual or group is ready to break out of established patterns of thought and become open to new possibilities, when she, he, or they are living, if only for a moment, beyond their comfort zone. In my experience, we find ourselves in teachable moments by one of two routes. Sometimes it is possible for a teacher deliberately to create the conditions for them through a sequence of assignments or developing a particular line of analysis, building momentum so that students gradually find themselves on new terrain and can say, aha, so that's how it works. Creating this kind of disciplined progress toward a goal is what makes teaching and learning part science. It focuses on diligent, methodical mastery of subject matter. But there is another route to those wonderful breakthroughs to new understanding, and it is here that good teaching is not science, but art. These occur when an individual student or an entire classroom finds itself through the complex, mysterious dynamics of individual or group development, beyond its comfort zone and broken open, ready for the word or the act that will move it to a new level of understanding. The teacher has to recognize such moments as they open up right in the middle of the classroom discussion or in private conversation with a student. For a teacher, there is nothing more exhilarating than serving as midwife to a eureka moment, recognizing a teachable moment as it begins to appear, rising to the opportunity, and literally seeing the individual or the group ascend to a new level of insight and maturity. Conversely, there is nothing worse than recognizing, usually in retrospect, that there was a golden opportunity of a teachable moment staring me in the face, and I didn't have the wit to recognize it. When that happens, I want to go home, crawl under the bed, and say, well, at least my mother loves me. I get some nodding heads in response to that, so you've been there. But it is also, of course, these very same failures that help us as teachers get better over time. There is a paradox, it thus appears, lying at the heart of the learning process. On the one hand, there is no substitute for tight discipline, for bearing down, for the rigorous, attentive, linear, often tedious activity that leads to mastery of the subject matter at hand. This is hard work, and progress is incremental. On the other hand, there are those sudden moments of breakthrough to a new level of understanding, transformative insight that comes on the heels not of bearing down, but of letting go. One's sense of agency evaporates, for these moments are not earned. They are unwarranted gifts. That's why we say of a brilliant insight someone has had, it just came to her. Or even, on occasion, it just came to me. Where it came from, we do not often say. if we do venture an answer to that question, it likely reflects our own personal assumptions about the way the universe works. My own favorite description of the source of these gifts of insight comes from the Isha Upanishad, and I quote, "It, the unnamed source of insight, it is infinitely complete, Purnam, in every way. Whatever comes forth from it is complete in just the same way. It is never diminished, no matter how much or what comes forth from it." Close quote. In a world where we are reminded daily of how limited the Earth's resources are on every front, it is intriguing, is it not, to hear tell of a resource that is experienced as infinite and inexhaustible. Teachable moments, then, are moments when we and our students are stretched beyond our respective comfort zones. In this situation, our role as teachers is twofold. It is to help our students engage the discomfort zone in which they find themselves by building a path through it, step by step. And it is also to be alert for signs in our students and in ourselves of those transformative breakthrough moments of insight. The balance between these two kinds of learning and these two kinds of teaching will, of course, vary from day to day, from faculty member to faculty member, from course to course, from class to class, and even from moment to moment within a given class. I invite us to pause for a moment, for each of us to think about how the best teacher you have ever known balances these two complementary skills in his or her teaching. And alongside of that, how do you balance them in your own teaching? The fourth snapshot for us to look at comes from my experience in teaching particular courses that deal with contemplative material and mysticism. It is primarily two courses that inform my reflection on these matters, though I almost always insert some contemplative or mystical material into all my courses for two reasons. One is that I myself am enriched by their lives and the literature of these kindred spirits, and I enjoy spending time in their company each semester. The other is that meditation and mysticism raise deep questions of meaning, questions that are often suppressed in the education that most undergraduates receive these days. The first course is one that I've taught dozens of times over the years, often with a title like Mystical Experience East and West. The other is a peace studies course I have developed more recently with the title Nonviolence, Global Citizenship and Contemplative Life. I have framed both courses in terms of a problem or a question to be explored by engaging primary source material from the world's mystical or contemplative traditions. In the Mystical Experience course, I usually frame the question as a debate. On the one side is Stephen Katz's famous provocative claim that, quote, "There are no pure, that is, unmediated experiences," close quote. That is, all mystical experiences, claims Katz, are a function of their conditioning environment. On the other side of the debate, there are the perennial philosophers, Robert Foreman, Rudolf Otto, Walter Stace, and others, claiming there is a common core to the world's mystical tradition, overarching or underlying all cultural differences. This has been an enormously rich and interesting debate over the last 35 years, and it is not over yet, since emerging research in neuroscience is bringing fresh evidence to our understanding of how the brain works, how nature and nurture actually intertwine in the changing neurology of the brain. My Peace Studies course takes as its framing issue a central paradox of contemplative life. As noted earlier, one of the virtually universal distinguishing features of contemplative life is the aspiration to live in the present moment, timelessly. On the other hand, contemplatives have often been involved in activist struggles to improve the social, economic, and political conditions of their time and place, striving for a better future. How can this be? Does not the aspiration to improve future living conditions compromise the contemplative aspiration to live in the present moment? Students quickly discover that there is no universal or theoretical resolution to this conundrum. It is a genuine, rich paradox. It simultaneously affirms the primacy of the present moment and a commitment to moving the future toward greater social equitability. We have here a situation that calls for Rilke's counsel to the young student, quote, "We should love the questions themselves. The point is to live everything. Live the questions now so that we might gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into an answer," close quote. In light of this paradox, the way I have helped students come to a deeper understanding is through the course's detailed attention to specific actions by particular individuals in their respective socio-cultural contexts. How have they lived the questions? So we look closely, for example, at Gandhi's thought and actions in engaging his cherished Bhagavad Gita. Ostensibly in that text, Krishna counsels Arjuna to fight his enemies in battle without regard for the fruits of action. But after deep soul-searching, Gandhi came to affirm that the Gita's central teaching is the advocacy of nonviolence, ahimsa, in both personal and public affairs. And for a very different example, we look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who prized above all other scripture the Sermon on the Mount and its counsel to love one's enemies. But after deep soul-searching, he came to see it as his Christian duty to participate in the plot to assassinate Hitler, a participation that cost him his life. What students come to see is that while there is no theoretical or general resolution to the paradox of contemplatives being simultaneously engaged in the present moment and in striving to improve the future, close examination of their lives shows how socially engaged contemplatives live at the intersection of head and heart in an endless sequence of present moments. Here is how Ludwig Wittgenstein characterizes life at this intersection, and I quote, "Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present." It's a wonderfully rich, complicated quotation, so let me read it again. "Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present." If you're interested, that's from his Tractatus 6.4311. What these two courses both produce in different ways and from different angles is an awareness that the inherited contrast of prophet and mystic fails to capture the complex ways in which inner and outer transformation intertwines in the actual lives of contemplatives and mystics. A more apt way of thinking about the contemplative life, we discover, is that it is lived along a spectrum. At one end are the recluses, those who withdraw from the world to live in seclusion. One thinks of Milarepa, of a yogi living in a Himalayan cave, of the Desert Fathers, and of solitary meditators in all traditions, including those in times past and today, who temporarily withdraw from the world on retreat. At the other end of the contemplative spectrum are the activists, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh, Dorothy Day, and their kin, all both deeply contemplative and deeply engaged in transforming the world. If one aspires not just to introduce students intellectually to this reign of contemplative options, but to invite them to explore the possibilities for themselves, they should see that no single point on this spectrum is fixed for all time. Rather, contemplatively inclined individuals move along the spectrum as time and circumstance and their own understanding of their calling evolve. Sometimes it is a call into oneself, and at other times it is a call into the world. Two faces of a single calling. Even the notion of a spectrum of contemplative experience may be too static and reified to capture the dynamism that characterizes the disciplined listening that is contemplative life. So here is a further image that I have found helpful and that will also return us to the classroom. The image comes from Parker Palmer, whose book, The Courage to Teach, is the best book on teaching I've ever read. In another of his books, A Hidden Wholeness, he suggests that our lived experience does not neatly segregate into inner and outer worlds. Rather, we are embodied beings situated in a world with which we engage with all our senses and with a rich, complex psychological apparatus. We are, of course, free to become utterly absorbed in our inner lives, insulating ourselves from external stimuli, the extreme case of which is solipsism. And we are also free to go in the other direction, to lose ourselves utterly in the external world and its countless attractions and distractions. But a healthy life, Palmer observes, consists of seamless attention to both inner and outer world. The model he ingeniously proposes is the mobius strip, where you have a strip of paper that ostensibly has two sides, but if you turn one end 180 degrees and then tape the ends together and put a pen on the surface and follow it around, you come right back to your starting point without ever going over an edge. If you're not familiar with it, play with it at home. Yeah. The mobius strip is a strange and wonderful phenomenon. It is the only one-sided object there is. Just as the point of the pen moves seamlessly across the entire surface of the mobius strip, so too, Palmer suggests, we can seamlessly direct our attention to the entire range of our experience with no need to segregate it into inner and outer. Such awareness enables us to lead what Palmer calls a life that is undivided no more. We human beings, too, are a strange and wonderful one-sided phenomenon. My fifth and final snapshot returns us to the definitions of contemplation and meditation with which we started. Meditation, I suggested, is disciplined listening to self and other, and an ever-present invitation to ever greater openness. As we have explored the dynamics of the conventional teaching and learning process, I have deliberately tried to use language that could also draw on this understanding of contemplative life. What is at stake in both contexts, I suggest, is discipline whether it is to know oneself and to master a certain subject matter, or to know and master oneself. And it is about openness, discipline and openness, a willingness to have one's expectations shattered en route to unprecedented knowledge and insight. It is tempting to pursue this parallel further. I wonder, for instance, about what we, as teachers, might learn in theory and practice from the Buddhist distinction between gradual enlightenment and sudden enlightenment, a distinction that underlies the difference between the Japanese Zen schools of Soto and Rinzai, respectively. It is tempting, too, to see a parallel with the well-known Theravada Buddhist distinction between two forms of meditation, shamatha and vipassana, with the former cultivating calm abiding, while the latter cultivates insight. More generally, I have found it useful to distinguish between low incandescence and high incandescence mystics. The former are exemplified by the quiet intellectual deepening and confidence of an Al-Ghazali, certain Upanishads, Nagarjuna, and Teilhard de Chardin, while the latter are found in the ecstasy, the passion, and the longing of a Rumi, a Blake, or a Ramakrishna. But this is an exploration for another time. Rather than explore that distinction in detail here, I simply offer the following suggestion from Coleman Barks, the brilliant translator of the Sufi poet Jalaluddin Rumi. In his interview with Bill Moyers, Barks says, and I quote, "I believe it doesn't really matter what the teacher talks about. You remember all those classes you took in college? It doesn't matter what was said. What we remember are a few presences. What was being taught was the presence of a few people, and there was a connection between the presence and us. But we sat there and took notes and thought we were studying the French Revolution or duck embryos or something, when what we were really learning about was coming through the teacher." Close quote. Does this not sound strikingly like what mystics and meditators have said about teachers and lineages around the world? That the knowledge truly worth having is an interpersonal knowledge, mediated at first hand, face to face. But, as I say, this is a matter for another time. By way of conclusion, let me touch on the ethical implications of the potential outcome of a meditatively informed education. Chogyam Trungpa, Naropa's founder, put this provocatively with his pithy little claim that the purpose of education is, quote, "to cultivate the tender heart of sadness." Cultivating the tender heart of sadness. Juxtaposed with most of today's university mission statements and marketing taglines, this seems at first blush to be positively bizarre, a morbidly pessimistic gloom that denies our cheerily optimistic public face. But at second blush, Trungpa is alleging something profound here. He is restating in contemporary language the first noble truth of Buddhism. Suffering is everywhere. This is the first thing to be said when doing an inventory of life's qualities for both humans and other sentient beings. "I show you suffering," said the Buddha. This is not, of course, the last thing to be said, for there are three more noble truths, and together they map out what can be done about the ubiquity of suffering in oneself and in others. And that, in turn, sets an agenda for a contemplatively informed education. Cultivating the tender heart of sadness doesn't initially say anything about the head or the mind or critical thinking. Cognitive development is not what contemplative education primarily or initially aspires to. Rather, it starts with the heart, the tender heart that so many contemplatives around the globe have affirmed to be the center of human experience. There is no Cartesian, I think, therefore I am. Although intellectual skills are a valuable and necessary secondary tool in understanding and addressing the forces that promote suffering in the world. In order to change the world, one has to understand how the world works. So contemplative education starts with the primacy of the aching heart and then builds intellectual skills to help address the ache. It is significant that one of today's most articulate advocates for an enlarged and more adequate understanding of liberal education, Martha Nussbaum, has been saying very much the same thing. In her article, Compassion and Terror, Nussbaum builds on classical and Enlightenment thought to develop a critical theory of compassion, a theory of critical compassion. She closes with a recommendation and an observation. The observation is that, and I quote, "An education in common human weakness and vulnerability should be a very profound part of the education of all children. Children should learn to be tragic spectators and to understand with subtlety and responsiveness the predicaments to which human life is prone. Through stories and dramas, they should learn to decode the suffering of others, and this decoding should deliberately lead them into lives both near and far, including the lives of distant humans and the lives of animals," close quote. Her observation is that, quote, "The chances of success in this enterprise will be greater if the society in question does not overvalue external goods of the sort that cause envy and competition," close quote. I close with a quotation from the Talmud, which seems particularly appropriate in light of today being Yom Kippur. In Hebrew scripture, Deuteronomy 6:4-5, is the famous Shema, the Hebrew confession of faith. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." This is followed in the text by the directive. "And these words which I, God, command you this day shall be upon your heart." In the Talmudic commentary on this passage, a curious student asks the rabbi, I quote, "Rabbi, please indicate why the text says that we should put these teachings on our heart rather than in our heart." The rabbi replies, "We say on the heart rather than in the heart because we do not have direct access to the inner workings of the heart. Therefore, we place the teachings on the heart so that when circumstances conspire and the heart breaks, the teachings will become available and they can pour into the heart's innermost parts." Close quote, close talk. Okay. That's it, yeah. That's it, yeah. Okay.